Hello, and welcome to Slate Money, your guide to the business and finance news of the week. I'm Emily Peck of Axios, and I'm here with Elizabeth Spiers of the New York Times and Slate.
Hello.
And Anna Szymanski of Reuters is here while Felix is off gallivanting around Japan.
Hello, hello.
And we've got a banger for you today. We're talking about the rising influence of billionaires in politics. Of course, we'll talk about some guy who rhymes with Elon Musk, probably. We're talking about the power of prediction markets like Polymarket and Kalshi in calling elections. And in our final segment, we're going to get philosophical. What does it mean really to live paycheck to paycheck? And that's all coming up on Slate Money. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with AutoQuote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
The reality is, guys prefer naturals. And if it's natural body wash you're looking for, Dr. Squatch has got you Natural Kings covered. The ingredients, naturals. Scent options, naturals. Around-the-clock moisturization, naturally. Now available in-store and online at drsquatch.com. Dr. Squatch Body Wash, for men who prefer natural.
So, we will start with the billionaires. I wanted to talk about this because there's this great piece in The New Yorker this week by Susan Glasser about how billionaires have come back to Trump. After 2020, a lot of them publicly distanced themselves, put out statements that they weren't going to support him anymore. They were done. They were so appalled by the January 6th insurrection. And then, slowly they started coming back. But that isn't quite what I want to talk about. In the middle of Glasser's piece, she starts sort of getting into the background on how campaign finance has really changed over the course of the past 2 decades. So like back in 2000, the Bush campaign sort of professionalized this idea of like the rich guy bundler. These are like wealthy Republicans who, they could only contribute so much to campaigns. So then they would work their networks and get all their rich friends to also donate to Bush and then bundle all that money together. And then, they would be called like the Rangers, or they would get special privileges if they raised $100,000 or $200,000. And that's kind of like, that's where the big money was. And that's where the rich guys were. And then in 2008, Obama figures out he can also get online donations from not rich people. He becomes the first candidate with $1 billion campaign. But then 2010 hits, the Citizens United decision comes down from the Supreme Court. That effectively ends restrictions on campaign fundraising, and it kicks off what Glasser calls sort of like a fundraising arms race that's essentially changed the nature of national elections. And that's what I wanted to talk about. And to help me do that, we have the amazing Elizabeth Spiers, who told us in our planning meeting that she is in cahoots, and that might be the wrong word, with the super PAC. So Elizabeth, I'm kind of hoping you can kind of explain how fundraising works in 2024 and the role that billionaires play.
Sure. Okay. So first of all, I'm not really in cahoots with the super PACs, but I do some political consulting, and I've been doing that since 2016. And so I've worked with super PACs and sometimes billionaires who are interested in political stuff. But, there are a couple of things to understand that I think are not common knowledge about how these things are financed. And the first thing is really, per Glasser's piece, bundlers still exist. But the mechanism that you probably hear about a lot more in terms of how billionaires put money into elections is the super PAC, which post Citizens United allows people to sort of donate unlimited amounts of money, and corporations can do that too. And these super PACs are basically organizations that don't have to report who their donors are. Personally, I would prefer that all of them be transparent, but they're not. So I'm not going to hold, Democrats to different standards than Republicans on that. But there are two other things that I think, you might see in a passing way when you're reading about these things. And one is that there are different types of nonprofit organizations that can do activities that are kind of politics adjacent, but can't be fully partisan. So, I think most people know what a 501c3 is. It's a charity organization, but there's also a nonprofit entity called a C4 that's a social welfare organization. And the difference is both of them are very limited in terms of how they can talk about elections. C4s are allowed to be a little bit more partisan in certain ways, but a C4 still has to devote most of its resources to what's considered social welfare. And that's fairly loosely defined. So let's say, for example, you have a C4 and your C4 is devoted to reproductive rights, supporting them. So ostensibly that would be a Democratic leaning organization, but you can talk about female reproductive rights outside of the context of politics. So a C4 could put money and resources behind, a specific candidate indirectly by talking about how reproductive rights affect people in the context of the election. So all of these things are they're not quite loopholes, but there are certainly areas that people treat as gray areas. And the C3 and C4 distinctions are important for donors because they're tax exempt. There are certain other types of political participation that aren't. So as a result, the way that money works in politics is just very opaque to people. There are not necessarily disclosure requirements for especially things like super PACs, where the billionaires like to put their money these days. So it's hard to trace who's funding what.
I think the funding itself is obviously opaque, but I also think it's somewhat challenging to know the actual impact, because I think there's this idea that more money always means substantially more impact. And I think if you're talking about down ballot races, smaller races, I think that's obviously true. But when you're talking about the presidential election, from what we saw with Hillary Clinton in 2016, I just wonder if that's necessarily still the case, especially given what this article, Emily, that you noted said, which was it's not that you have a ton of billionaires or a ton of people who are supporting Trump. It's actually a small number of people who are just putting forward a lot of money.
One thing she noted was that 68% of the money being donated to Republicans is coming from big donors. So it seems like it's a small group of people donating a big lot of money. And it's 59% for Dems. So it's not like they're like the party of the little guy necessarily.
Yeah, I think people don't realize how recent the small donor phenomenon is, though. It's really did start with Obama, and partly because things like Act Blue made it really easy for people to donate. They keep your credit card on file. And so it's almost like what people think of as the promise of micropayments. If you don't actually have to fill out a form, and it's just like, oh, I can give a candidate $3 instead of, I think pre-Obama, if you thought about being a political donor, you would think like, oh, well, I've got to give at least, $200 or something. You think of it as something a rich person does. And now people just don't think about it that way.
So actually you're saying, because the piece was like big donors basically are controlling these parties. But what you're kind of saying is if we went back 30 years ago, the amount of money coming from big donors would be probably higher because there weren't any little donors at all.
I think as a ratio, definitely. That said, Citizens United has opened the door for a lot more money in politics simply because corporations are treated like people.
And I think about it too in terms of with Obama, I think part of the idea was that even if they've only donated $1, money makes people act in a way that nothing else does. So even if it's just $1, all of a sudden people feel like they're invested. So it actually means that they might be more likely to vote. So it's almost like you would rather have 1 million people giving $1, right, than one person giving $1 million. And I don't know if there's necessarily been any type of study that shows whether that's accurate or not. But I'm just curious because I think now it's easy to say like, well, it would be far easier if you're in a party to just raise money from a few people. But is that actually going to have the same political impact as raising a small amount of money from a ton of people?
Well, there are two factors there. One is that your number of donors is important, in down ballot races, especially because, there are qualifying levels for certain things. But the other thing is that if you're going out and you're raising money from the big donors, it's very helpful to say, look, we have all this small donor support. That means that, we have people who are not necessarily rich. They're very invested. They're highly engaged. Because if you're donating to a political campaign in any capacity, you're by definition a highly engaged voter. Also, another thing that the Obama administration did that sort of made it easier for people, although easier for, people to spend money, was their campaign had a offer at the beginning of I can't remember which term, where if you wanted Obama bumper stickers, they would give you them for free, but you had to pay shipping and handling. And what that required you to do was to put in a credit card number. So, which meant that, they had your credit card information. So the next time you wanted to, they would email you later and say, can you donate $3? And you don't have to go in and register or anything like that because they've already got your information. And they can target you for volunteering. They could ask you if you want a yard sign because you've demonstrated that you're already pretty engaged if you want a bumper sticker.
So it seems like on the small donor end, it's about turning out the vote. It's about enthusiasm. It's a marketing play.
Yeah, Anna's right. People are more invested even if they donate a little bit. It makes them pay more attention to the election because they feel like they literally invested in it.
But I want to get back to the rich guys and gals putting in a lot of money in this election. And I guess we should talk about the biggest, richest guy of all, Elon Musk.
So Elon Musk has basically been running a sweepstakes for registered voters where he's giving out, periodically $1 million to them, or he says he is. And the DOJ sent him a warning letter about this because you're not allowed to pay people to vote or to pay them to register to vote. And, Elon's already been sort of splashing around in the mucky gray area of this by offering people $47 to sign a petition that says they support the First or Second Amendment and then using it to target them in battleground states. So that's not technically paying them to vote, but it's definitely a sort of violation of the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. But, Elon does that in every sphere of his life.
It's kind of his thing.
Yeah. And I mean, there's another law that says if you're a government contractor, you can't put money into super PAC. But Elon is technically not personally a government contractor. So I get, he's allowed to do that. But it's definitely a sort of violation of the spirit of the law in that sense, because it's designed to keep government contractors from trying to influence partisan politics.
So he has a super PAC. How much money has it spent? And is he the only one that donates to it? And what does it do?
I haven't seen numbers for how much money's in the super PAC. I think he put $75 million into it. And usually it's kind of rare that super PACs are single donor. They usually do allow other people to contribute and they want other people to contribute. So it's just a mechanism for them to spend money. And Elon has not been shy about saying he is funding these things. I think the billionaires who are reluctant to do it are the ones supporting Democrats because they're afraid of retaliation if Trump gets into office.
Before we talk about that, I just want to make sure I understand this. There is a limit on how much an individual contributor can spend and can donate to a campaign. Do you know what the limit is?
Yeah, well, it differs. So if you're donating, for example, to a PAC, your individual top level contribution is around $5,000. But there are exceptions where they're sort of like you can also contribute to, a fund for a recount, or it varies from state to state. And if you really want to hit that upper limit, you get further than, the usual. Most people's upper limit is around like $2,200.
So there's like their limits vary, but $2,200 might be the upper limit.
If you have a super PAC, there's not really a limit.
Yeah, but someone like Elon Musk can then put $75 million into a super PAC.
Exactly.
So there is no limit. That's sort of unbelievable that is how it is. And you hear people kind of whining about it at the margins, but on its face, it's absurd.
Well, people don't understand how absurd it is. And I think I think we all understand that money corrupts politics but I don't think people understand the extent to which, a handful of small players or, billionaires in particular can do this at such an extreme level. Or people just, in as much as they do understand it, just accept it as reality because we do have a political system where money buys influence.
And I think in the case of Musk, it's also doubly troubling because he essentially also owns this large section of the public square by owning, X/Twitter, as well as putting all of this money in.
And he gets hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe more, from the federal government in various contracts for SpaceX and the other one, the satellite internet.
It's true. Although I will say, and this is slightly off topic, but when people say that they think Musk is doing this because, he's trying to benefit his companies, I'll be perfectly honest. I think he's probably doing this because of just pure ideological reasons more than because he really wants to get a little bit of extra funding or some tax breaks for his companies.
Yeah, I think, he wants influence, but he already has that.
Exactly.
I had a very minor, polite argument with a donor advisor to another billionaire about a week ago because she said, I think he bought X so that, he would have all this influence if Trump won. And I said, I just don't understand the math of that. He's paid $44 billion for it. It's losing money. It's become a highly concentrated area for right-wing people, but that's just Musk preaching to the choir. And I just don't see what he gets out of owning X politically that he doesn't already have. He's giving Trump so much money. He's doing rallies with him. Like, forget X. He has access to Trump and influence already. He doesn't need a social platform on top of that.
I guess if it's about ideology, then what he's done with X is completely reshape it to fit his ideology. And that's a huge win.
Yeah, but also while running it into the ground. And, it's like, is he willing to fund it at a loss forever? He's making it into what Gab aspires to be. But part of the value of Twitter was that it wasn't a concentration of, ideologically homogenous people who already agree with Elon Musk.
Musk aside, Anna, do you think all this money flowing from the billionaires? I mean, Glasser says they're expecting to see $1 billion donation like any day now, basically. Do you think it's distorting politics or this election? And if so, how?
I mean, I think certainly when you start to talk about money of that level, the only thing I would say is like, I'm curious, and I don't know this. I don't know if anyone knows this. If it's linear, I mean, I think it's definitely not linear, but just in the sense that I think there's this idea that if you give a certain amount of money, you have a certain amount of influence. And if you give double that amount of money, you have double that amount of influence. But I would actually imagine it's incredibly diminishing returns the more you move up that ladder. Again, to me, it goes back to that whole idea that, number one, I think the way politics have changed from what we saw with Trump. And maybe this was just a Trump phenomenon, but he obviously had far less money than the Clinton campaign and yet was able to win. Obviously, with the Biden campaign, it was quite close. I just wonder that when you get into the modern age of politics where so much of stuff is essentially free advertising, whether money does have, it's always going to have a massive influence. We're talking about billions of dollars. Of course, that's going to have an influence. But I don't know if it has maybe when you're talking about a presidential election, quite the amount that people might think, where again, if you're talking about a smaller election, then I think certainly it does.
I think it does. I mean, partly because things like broadcast ads are the most expensive, part of running a national campaign. They're way more expensive than people realize, and that's where a lot of the money goes. But also, you have the cost of running a good ground game. Even with as much money is going into the presidential elections, you still find areas that are super understaffed for canvassing. They don't, or in down ballot elections, even more so, you have under-resourced campaigns. And this is part of the reason why when Democrats are sort of figuring out where to put or how to allocate funds, there are a lot of states that they consider lean Republican that could be purple that they just totally ignore because there's just not enough resources. So even with the numbers we're talking about, we haven't, I think, hit any kind of ceiling where people are sitting around going, oh God, I have extra money. It's just not, it's all going out the door.
And I maybe to just kind of actually like counter my own point is that, right, so you just said that, of course you can think about it that like, look, if you have two people who are giving you, $800 million, that then enables you to reach a lot of small donors.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that, of course, is the way where the one can quite easily feed into the other.
Also, the people who are savvy, donors understand that, they are putting money in for influence. But if your candidate doesn't win, it doesn't matter. You're not getting that anyway. So if they feel like the campaign is underfunded, they'll up, the amount of money that they're giving. And they don't necessarily expect that they're going to get more influence, but they expect that it'll help their candidate win.
That's a good point. The last thing I wanted to mention, and Elizabeth, you kind of like hinted at it before, is that we also had these reports the past week about Harris donors who are keeping it quiet. There was Bill Gates who made, was it $50 million donation to the Harris campaign, but didn't want the news out. And then there's Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, who's also supporting Harris, but doesn't want that out. And Felix actually had a good piece about this over the summer. And he compared this phenomenon of these like quiet Democratic Harris donors to Pascal's wager, which is the idea that, you know, you should believe in God because the downside is pretty harsh there. But with Trump, you know, you want to be vocal in your support for him, and you want to be quiet if you don't support him because he will retaliate to those against those who don't support him or have been outspoken against him. So no CEO wants to step up and say anything very bad, or, you know, they'll say they're not sure, whatever, just on the chance that he gets put into the White House and could retaliate. Whereas if the candidate like Harris gets into the White House, you know, she's probably not going to go out and like retaliate against the CEOs who wronged her. Maybe she will. I don't know. But that's the idea anyway. Do you think there's something to that?
Yeah. And it's not just, you know, that Trump would retaliate. You know, some of his supporters tend to retaliate in a way that, you know, hers don't.
Yeah. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I also think it probably has to do with the fact that you may have a lot of, you know, CEOs, other people who are high up in companies that may support a Democrat, maybe moderates who would, you know, have supported a Republican in a different election. They'll support Harris in this one. And the country has become so ideological that they also just might not want to be out there because they don't want to make a huge ideological point. They just think one party is far more reasonable at this point than the other, but they just don't want to get into this scrum. So they're more likely to be quiet. Whereas if people are vocal supporters of Trump, then obviously they're going to be fairly ideological people. So I think that's also where you see this little mismatch.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. There are people who believe that, you know, the Republican Party in theory is better for capitalists, even though on many economic measures it's not, but they may not want to associate themselves with more of a Democratic brand, especially if they perceive it as being, you know, more progressive than it is.
Yeah. And I guess for Gates, he has in the past tried to stay neutral because the foundation wants to work with whoever's in charge in the White House on various projects and initiatives.
It's the money.
This episode is brought to you by Public.com. Did you know you can lock in a 6% or higher yield with a bond account at Public.com? The Federal Reserve recently announced a big rate cut, and there could be more rate cuts this year and in 2025 as well. That's good news if you're looking to buy a home, but it might not be so good for the interest you earn on your cash. So, if you want to lock in a 6% or higher yield with a diversified portfolio of high yield and investment grade bonds, check out Public.com. It only takes a couple of minutes to sign up. And once you lock in your yield, you can earn regular interest payments even as rates decline. Lock in a 6% or higher yield with a bond account at public.com/Slate Money. But remember, your yield is not locked in until you invest. Brought to you by Public Investing, member FINRA and SIPC. As of September 26, 2024, the average annualized yield to worst across the bond account is greater than 6%. Yield to worst is not guaranteed. Not an investment recommendation. All investing involves risk. Visit public.com/disclosures/bond-account for more info. Have you heard about Doublenomics? It's okay if you haven't. It's extremely niche and practiced by Discover. Here's an example. Discover automatically doubles the cash back earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/credit card. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about money in politics, but from a totally different angle. I want to talk about prediction markets because this campaign cycle, this election year, we're hearing so much about them. There's Polymarket, which you can't really use in the US. It's a crypto-based betting market where you can make bets on the election, but you're seeing the charts about Polymarket. You're seeing them everywhere. There's Kalshi, there's PredictIt. These are places where you can go and you can bet money on the outcome of the election. And right now, on all these prediction markets, especially Polymarket, they're all giving Trump about 60% chance of winning in 2 weeks, or less than 2 weeks, actually. even though we're seeing polls that show the race pretty much tied. So that's led to a lot of stories sort of speculating like, well, what's going on? Are the prediction markets right and the polls wrong? Are the prediction markets like in the tank for Trump? I mean, what should I think, Anna?
It's interesting. So I think the theory behind prediction markets is that, well, these should be better than polls because people are, when they're putting money behind something, they have, more of they're really going to say what they think as opposed to a poll where, maybe there's going to be issues with how the polling is run, all of those things. So it's like, oh no, the market is going to give you the better, like more efficient answer. And I think in this instance, that's almost certainly not true. And I don't think that necessarily means that you have people who are actively trying to, manipulate the results of the election. I think that's going to be a hard claim to prove. However, I do think it's fairly clear that when you're talking about markets that really just have very, very, very low liquidity, there are only a small number of people who are actively in these markets, and thus a small amount of money or $20 million can have a pretty significant impact on what that market is showing because of one or potentially, I think in poly market, maybe up to 4 people, what they think. And that 4 people may also be one person. It's hard to know. So I would say that this is definitely an instance where I don't think it is right to say, oh, well, clearly the betting markets are just telling us something that polls are not.
Yeah. And so, Anna, what you're talking about is there was this news, the Wall Street Journal first reported it, and then there was follow-up reporting that there are these 4 accounts on Polymarket: Freddie 9999, Theo 4, Princess Caro, and Michi. I don't know how to pronounce that one. But they had put about, I think it was a $30 million bet spread around on Trump. And, there was like speculation, is this like some kind of Trump whale trying to move the market in his favor or, whatever. And then Polymarket said, well, it is one person, a French person, national, who is very sophisticated investor or something like that.
A very sophisticated investor who apparently doesn't know what a basis point is. This is another issue.
Wait, why doesn't?
No, there were some comments apparently this person made on a message board that suggested that they weren't entirely sure of some like pretty basic financial concepts would suggest that maybe this is not a very sophisticated investor.
I think Freddie 9999 seems very sophisticated, but okay. I don't know. But yeah, and so that led to, a lot of stories about, are these markets, rigged or favoring Trump? One of my theories is just like the people who are betting in crypto are probably more in line with like the Trump demographic. We know the crypto demographic is more pro-Trump because he has been more pro-crypto, and Trump skews more male. I think the people who bet on elections, I haven't seen the data, but I'm sort of guessing they're more.
I think it's a safe guess that the majority of people in these markets are male. Like, I think we can say that.
Also, U.S. citizens can't bet on Polymarket.
Right.
So the people who are betting are really,
at least not unless they have a VPN, but yeah.
That's true. But I think, a lot of them are not exactly close to the American political situation. They're sort of observing from afar. And there just aren't that many of them.
The odds on Kalshi, which just opened up as a platform in the US and just because of a court decision was able to open up election betting, the odds there in favor of Trump are also about 60%. So, and I think all the prediction market odds are about 60%, which is, about 10 points over where the polls are.
Which, frankly, if you think about it, again, going back to that idea that almost certainly these markets are skewing towards Trump's demographic. So in a way, the fact that it's only roughly a 10% different or 10 percentage point difference is actually, if you think about it, not that huge.
Yeah. Also, my bet is that they skew enormously male. And I think when you look at the and probably white, the demographics that are most anti-Kamala for reasons that have to do with, hegemonic masculinity and sexism or that demo. So they're going to be, I think, a little bit more pessimistic about her chances, even if they're putting money on it.
So, yeah. So, if you think about it in this way, it's almost as though I would argue that if you look at what's happening in the betting markets and you look at what's happening in polls, the fact that difference is quite significant. But again, if you were to just poll, crypto males in general about who they want to win the election, who they think to win the election, I would actually argue you probably would think it would be far more than that. So then that might also just indicate how incredibly close this election actually is.
I like that. Another thing I was reading about this morning, reflexivity, which is a concept George Soros apparently coined. Reflexivity, which is basically this idea that markets don't just reflect reality, but they can change reality. Or in other words, like the fact that Trump does have this lead in the prediction markets is getting a lot of press coverage, a lot of media attention. We just, in Axios Markets, we ran the chart today showing the red line, up and to the right and the blue line going the other way. That could create a new reality. It could discourage some marginal Harris voting or something. It could create a perception that he's leading in the polls themselves.
I don't see how that would happen. It's so few people are aware of what prediction markets are and even less aware of, what they're saying right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see it, really influencing, aside from the media stories that just say, here's what the prediction markets are saying, especially how marginal voters behave. First of all, there aren't very many marginal voters 2 weeks before an election. But the things that move them tend to be the most arbitrary things that you would imagine, but they're not necessarily things that highly engaged people know about or that they would care about. So I just have trouble imagining a scenario where that would be the case, especially when polling says something totally different.
I mean, I would agree with you that I think it's probably in this case not going to have a massive, massive, massive impact. But I would say we all know that the media likes to report on things that are new and different and that are outliers because it's a much better story than being like, oh, look, it's still close. So obviously, if you have these prediction markets that seem to be showing you something very different, that is going to be a story. And that story is going to get magnified. And then that is going to get magnified on multiple different platforms. And considering how close this election probably is, if it's not necessarily changing someone's mind, but if it's more just the idea of getting more people to vote or less people to vote, then it, could have an impact. Now, of course, you could argue in both directions, though, right? Because you could say, on the one hand, it could make people demoralized and be like, well, why am I even going to vote if my candidate's so far behind? But it could also be like, oh, I'm concerned my candidate's behind. I'm going to get more people out to vote. So it's tricky to really try to gauge exactly what the impact is going to be.
Yeah, I also wonder if that theory really comes from the fact that predictive markets can change, market prices for companies because it seems a little more rational to look at things that are market-like when talking about market prices. But when you're talking about voter sentiment, that's kind of just a different ball of wax.
Yeah, this was something that was funny. I thought actually in that article, Emily, that you mentioned here, they were referring to the efficient market hypothesis. And I'm like, yeah, that makes sense if you're talking about companies and all the information one can know about a company. When you're talking about really much more betting, I feel like the efficient market hypothesis breaks down a little bit there.
Wait, but Anna, you're a sports person. I mean, what about the efficient markets hypothesis in sports betting? Sports
betting is like the reason that it's great to be a sports gambling company is because people suck at sports betting. I mean, there's a reason that every sports gambling company in the world will offer you a parlay. It's because they never work.
Can you explain what a parlay is?
It's just it's where you have this multiple things have to happen in order for something to pay off.
Okay.
So no, I mean, it's these types of things are, there's a reason that people like to bet. It's fun. It's exciting. While yes, there are elements of investing that can certainly look like gambling. In theory, these should actually be different things if one is using actual, analysis of company financials versus I'm just going to guess based on, whether I like the Jets or the Giants.
The vibes.
There's all this prop betting on Polymarket. During the first presidential debate, there were a bunch of people betting about whether Beyonce was going to be the guest. And it's like, there's no analysis that goes into that.
No, prop bets are my absolute favorite.
I mean, that's what one of the editors at Axios was saying. You can just bet on little things every day, or you could be in and out of bets. You might not think Trump is going to win, but you see him get shot at and you think, oh, I bet his odds of winning the election are going to go up because people are going to be very sympathetic. So you make a bet on that. And then, yes, his odds did go up after he was shot to like 70% or something. And then you quickly get out because you figure, oh, it's probably going to fade. You could do all kinds of fun stuff. Also, I just want to tell you guys something, and I wanted to see how the prediction market betting works. So I went to Kalshi and I bet $10. I just want you to know.
Which way did you bet, Emily?
I'm going to keep that private. I just want to tell you that it was incredibly easy. Like I was shocked. I put in my phone number. The site then found my name, my address, my social security number, and my bank account off my phone number. I was shocked and connected all of that through Plaid in about 2 minutes. It was the most simple financial transaction. It was like easier than buying shoes. So I don't know, food for thought there, I guess.
That seems not great.
It doesn't seem great. I could have bet my whole bank account.
Far easier than actually voting.
Yeah. Oh, way easier than voting. Okay. Everybody vote.
Nobody bet.
It's too late for me.
It's our public service announcement.
This episode is brought to you by GiveWell. You like to optimize things. You've chosen the perfect credit card to maximize your travel points, and you always find the fastest route when you drive. Shouldn't you handle your charitable giving the same way? GiveWell spends 50,000 hours every year doing deep dives into different charitable programs to help you do the most good for your dollar. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed choices about high-impact giving. All of their research and recommendations is available on their site for free, and you can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. Give to givewell.org to find out more or make a donation. Select podcasts and enter Slate Money at checkout to make sure they know you heard about them from us. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more. Parents do everything they can to set their kids up for a successful future. Academics, team sports, college admissions. But what about getting started financially when they're out on their own? Opening a UGMA Kids Investment Account with Fabric starts their investment journey early and gives them a financial head start. I'm a parent. It's really important to invest for your child's future, no matter how you do it. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kids investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/slatemoney. That's meetfabric.com/slatemoney. MEET fabric.com/slatemoney. This is a paid promotion for the Fabric UGMA product and not for investment advisory services. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Custodial services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Terms apply. Learn more at meetfabric.com. So for our last topic, I wanted to take you guys back to 2013, to Twitter in its heyday. There was a famous tweet from @Drill. I think a lot of people know who that is. And it kind of encapsulates what I want to talk about for this last segment. The tweet reads like this: food, $200. Data, $150. Rent, $800. Candles, $3,600. Someone who is good at the economy, please help me budget this. My family is dying. So
candles are expensive.
They are. No, they can break you. Well, because I wanted to talk about not really this tweet, but this idea of living paycheck to paycheck, which I think to most people's minds means a family or a person who's really struggling to just make rent and buy food every month. They're waiting for their paycheck to come in. I mean, I've been there back in the day, and you're like, just got to get paid so I can get all my bills set, and then you have nothing left over. And that's what paycheck to paycheck means. But my colleague at Axios wrote a story this week about the fact that most Americans, a majority, are telling survey takers they live paycheck to paycheck. But when you sort of dig in, that's not quite it. I mean, in fact, they are living paycheck to paycheck, but it's because they're spending so much money on extras, travel, restaurants, clothes, the non-essentials. It's not like they're at risk of eviction or foreclosure. You know, it's more like the candles are breaking their budgets.
And again, these are also people who have often savings. So if you have savings, then obviously if, technically you're then not really living paycheck to paycheck because you could dip into savings if you needed to.
Yeah. But what do you guys think? Do you think that like paycheck to paycheck is the whole concept's kind of untethered from reality at this point?
I think what people mean by it colloquially is just like if you missed a paycheck, would you feel like you were screwed? And for some people, especially higher income people who have a house, that could just mean you have a fixed mortgage and you have other payments that are associated with that you can't easily get out of if you need to lower your expenses. But in the broader sense, I think you're right that people are sort of broadening the definition. But I think as a measure of sentiment, it's just supposed to be like, how financially secure do you feel? Could you miss a paycheck and still feel like you're fine?
And we know from the surveys, and I want to ask you about this, Anna, we know, at least since the pandemic, that sentiment about the economy has been pretty dismal, right? Even as the economy, and we've talked about this a lot on the show, is in fairly good shape.
I mean, the sentiment really had its kind of nadir with the rise of inflation. As the rate of inflation has come down, you have definitely seen some improvement, which is unsurprising because people really, really hate inflation, it turns out. Now, in terms of how you actually calculate sentiment, it's really complicated for multiple reasons, partly because, if you look at the University of Michigan survey, number one, there clearly are issues with political polarization. And then number two, there also are issues now with how UMich is calculating that they're doing surveys online versus doing surveys via phone. And that seems to be potentially having an impact. So sentiment itself is a very kind of squishy thing. So I think it's sometimes tough to draw too much to that. But one of the things I know friends of mine who used to look at this all the time where I worked would always say, you want to sometimes focus a little bit less on the level and more on the direction. Because even if the level is off because of some of these things, the direction will usually tell you a story that's actually legitimate. And I think the story that it's telling, which is the idea that as prices were increasing significantly, people read that as the idea that their financial situation was decreasing demonstrably. As the price increase has declined, people feel better. However, the reality is that prices are still very high. Obviously, they're not coming down. They're just increasing at a slower rate. So then it's also not overly surprising that people aren't going to be feeling as good as they did, maybe 6 years ago. But again, I guess the point is just when you're looking at these type of things, look at the direction, not the level.
Right. And the Journal had a good story about how basically Americans they're fine for the most part, economically, financially. They're okay. But inflation has taken a psychological toll on them. And the piece has all these examples. There's like a woman who her salary has outpaced the rate of inflation, but she talks to the Journal about how like it annoys her when she goes to the store now and she has to pay like $2 more for her organic berries. And there's like all these examples of people that are just like mad because when you go to the store, you're like, this shouldn't cost as much as it does. It doesn't matter that I can afford it.
And I mean, the berries aside, I think there is something real there because for a lot of, recent years, even though you were seeing, actual wage gains, real wages were actually declining because inflation was so high. So there was something actually very real there. Now that has changed, obviously, over the last year or so. But people aren't wrong when they're saying that a lot of things cost far more than they used to. And I think this is one of the areas where it puts the Democrats in a bit of a pickle because you can tell people, oh, well, the inflation rate is declining, but that's not how people perceive inflation. They perceive it as, what am I paying today? What was I paying 4 years ago? That's how they perceive it.
In my sort of usual informal survey of, Trump supporting family on Facebook, they're all talking about gas prices. And part of the issue is if you are paying attention to something that's volatile intrinsically, and the prices seem a little bit high because you buy gas on a regular basis and you buy it in isolation, you pay more attention to the price of it. Whereas when you go to the grocery store, you're usually buying, a bunch of different things. So you don't have this recent number stuck in your head, with the exception of the lady and her organic blueberries, of the price of literally everything you're buying individually. But gas prices, you really do. And so that's become a proxy for the way people think about inflation in a lot of cases, because it is, they notice it when it goes up and they pay extra attention to it specifically, but it's not a core measure of inflation.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter because, voters don't care. They're like, well, it's expensive.
Also, energy prices are obviously quite a bit lower than they were, say, right after Russia invaded Ukraine. So it's an odd thing for people to be focusing on in terms of energy prices.
But I get it. There was a couple in the piece and they said their like lawn care. I mean, if you're paying for lawn care, you're not living paycheck to paycheck. But they said their lawn care price had gone over $1,000. And they were like, we're raking our leaves now ourselves because we can afford it, but we just won't cross that Rubicon of $1,000 lawn care.
No one has ever explained to me why you need to rake leaves.
It's good for the grass.
What's going to happen if you don't?
I think, doesn't the grass die if you don't rake the leaves?
I don't know. It seems like nature knows what it's doing by having leaves drop, but I could be wrong.
You guys, I think if you want to have a lawn, you need to rake the leaves or blow them. But that's like, we could do a whole plus on the leaf blower controversies. We won't. I won't subject city dwellers to that. So, Anna, what is your budget for candles? Or what are your budget essentials aside from food and shelter?
So I was thinking about this because I was thinking about when I moved, what were like the first things that I purchased that just made sure I had to have. And quite literally, almost the first purchase I made when I landed in the UK was a new Nespresso machine because I couldn't bring my old one because it wouldn't work in the UK. And so I think there are things like, good coffee, running shoes. I needed like good running shoes because I needed new ones. That was another one. And as anyone who are runners knows, you have to replace those quite frequently. Also, I've gotten very into cut flowers in the last few years.
Whoa.
And they are expensive, but once you get used to having them and then you don't have them, it's incredibly depressing. I also bought a new KitchenAid very, very quickly after I moved to the UK. So these are some of my things that really in the reality they shouldn't actually be essentials to any human, but they are in fact essentials to me.
Is the Nespresso the one with the little K-cups?
Yes.
Will you send me a link to the one you use? Because I think I want one.
Yes, I will.
Thanks.
It's wonderful.
Okay. So those were your essentials. You're burning through your paychecks, just buying running shoes, basically.
Indeed. Which is kind of true.
Elizabeth, what are your essentials there? Tattoos.
Yeah, that's part of it. That's not a regular expense, but certainly it's one that you end up justifying to non-tattooed friends and family who don't understand why you would spend a lot of money to have somebody stick needles in you for hours. I think for me, my favorite way to take a vacation without taking a vacation is to sit at a bar at a nice restaurant and read a novel and have like a nice sit down meal. And so if I look at where I probably should be saving money, but I don't, it's eating out. And then the other thing is just because I'm freelance, I have to spend a lot of money on things that I think a lot of people wouldn't need to, that just things like subscriptions to stuff, because I don't get them through a corporation. And that's still a cash outlay, even if I can write it off. And you would be, every month I get a subscription, expense that I totally forgot about that hits me in like some $300 increment. And it's brutal. So I consider that the kind of thing that's sort of in between. It's something that I need to do my job, but it's like, would I die if I didn't have an FT subscription?
I might.
No.
Yeah. I like my FT subscription. My essentials, I feel like I have a lot of essentials. It's kind of troubling. There's Diet Coke. There's the small luxury of going to Starbucks or other coffee places when you could make it at home, but it's just so much better going out. There's the running shoes, of course. We haven't talked about the iPhone. I guess maybe that's like actually an essential at this point. It would count food, rent, iPhone. But like my iPhone didn't work the other morning because it updated and it made it all janky. And I was like, oh my God, like if this doesn't work, I have to like run out and get a new one right away. And that's a huge expense. And I think maybe a necessity. I could be wrong and just addicted to my phone, but I don't think so.
No, I think a phone is like a limb at this point.
Yeah, it's like a limb. I was like, why isn't it working? So those I think are my essentials. And yeah, and I like to spend a lot of money. I'm not like a shoe person, but I don't like to buy cheap shoes. So those are some of mine. Before we get to the numbers round, I want to tell you about Slate Plus today, our bonus mini episode available in your feed if you're a Plus member. This week, we're talking about energy drinks, how they've become really super popular and why, and what energy drinks do to you. And Slate Plus members can access that in their feeds right now. And if you're not a Slate Plus member and you don't want to hear ads, but you do want to hear a bunch of other great Slate stuff, you should sign up for Slate Plus, because with Slate Plus, you get ad-free listening on all the Slate podcasts, plus unlimited access to all Slate.com content. And there's a newsletter just for members. And of course, the exclusive bonus segment on every regular Slate Money episode. So subscribe now on Apple Podcasts by clicking try free at the top of our show page, or slate.com/moneyplus. That's slate.com/moneyplus.
Mothers know all about life's tricky transitions. Thankfully, Ollie helps you prioritize wellness through every age, life stage, or magnificent mood change. Need a multitasking multivitamin that keeps up with you? How about an essential prenatal for you and baby? Ollie's got you through it all. Life's tricky. Your wellness routine shouldn't be. Get what you need at ollie.com.
Okay, we can move on to the numbers round. Yes?
Sounds good.
Let's do it.
Elizabeth, what do you got?
My number is 2, and that's the number in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. The second movie I've decided is the best one, because last night I was watching it with my 9-year-old who loves horror, and I realized that the entire Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise is just a horror story about automation.
What?
Because the Sawyer family, their lore is that and this is the family that, if you have not seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre, holds up in their house, and they run a meat company or small business butchering thing. And so the lead character in the series is Leatherface, who runs around chopping people up with a chainsaw so they can make human chili,
As you do,
in their business. But the backstory is that Grandpa Sawyer worked for a slaughterhouse and then was infuriated by automation and was laid off. And there's an actual line in it. There's a quote from the patriarch, who's still alive. He says, "The electrified cages, the cold steel chutes, the air-powered head hammers, that drove Grandpa crazy." And then he complains about small business taxes. So if the slaughterhouse had never been automated, Texas people would not have been chopped up in chainsaws in this series.
lives would have been saved. Wow, we could all just have chili with regular beef in it. And
Non-human in it,
Non-human.
Those small business taxes, man.
Anna, what do you got?
My number is 14.2. So it's 14.2%. So apparently that is the average annual return on a Birkin bag over the last 35 years. So I found the statistic in a particularly amazing legal document for this case of these 3 people who are suing Hermes, because they're basically saying that they are being forced to buy other Hermes products in order to be eligible to purchase a Birkin bag. And it is, I highly recommend people read this document, because it is just, you go and you're like, who are these people? Because they just keep talking and complaining about these things. And then you get to a point where they're like, they say to purchase another Birkin bag. And then you realize they already own Birkin bags. They're suing because they can't purchase additional Birkin bags. Anyway, I enjoyed
I
it.
feel like we talked about that at some point. And it's a big week for handbags, because the FTC succeeded in blocking a handbag merger between Capri and Tapestry, which makes Coach and Kate Spade handbags. So very on topic. So my number is 15.4. That's million. And that is the number of copies of Costco Connection. That's Costco's in-house magazine that are mailed to executive members who pay double the yearly membership fee of $65 to get the magazine delivered. It is the country's 3rd largest magazine by print calculation, behind 2 other magazines from the AARP. And there's this delightful piece in the New York Times by Maddie Kahn, who I guess made it her journalistic mission for the past several years to write about this magazine that's so popular that, like, Oprah's been on the cover, and Bruce Springsteen and Tom Hanks. And the readers of the magazine are like, they're doing really great. They have no trouble buying candles or cut flowers or whatever they need. Nearly 93% own their homes. The readers are super engaged. It was just sort of a delightful piece about a magazine doing well, which I miss the days of magazines. So I was kind of heartened to read it, and sad that I am not a Costco member and can't get the Costco connection. And that's it for our show today. You can find links to some of the stuff we talked about on our show page. Our producers are Shana Roth and Jared Downing. You can write to us at slatemoney@slate.com. I'm Emily Peck, and on behalf of me, Anna Szymanski, and Elizabeth Spiers, thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next week on Slate Money. Have you heard about Doublenomics? It's okay if you haven't. It's extremely niche and practiced by Discover. Here's an example. Discover automatically doubles the cash back earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with cashback match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. It pays to Discover. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
If you have Medicare and Medicaid, then keep listening. You may qualify for a dual special needs plan from United Healthcare. It's time you feel confident you're managing your whole health. With a dual special needs plan from United Healthcare, it's not just health insurance, it's healthy living. You deserve coverage you can count on, so why not see how a dual special needs plan from United Healthcare may help you get extra Medicare benefits? If you live in the DC area, see your options today at uhcdualplans.com.